Good morning. On behalf of the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes Administrator Group, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, a COVID-19 webinar. A special thank you to Joe Schwimmer for coordinating this webinar and to our panelists, James Jordan, Wajida Small, Lori Casalonis, and Todd Raylew. If you will, please join me for a short prayer. God of work and rest and pleasure, grant that what we do may be for us an offering rather than a burden, and for those we serve, may it be the help that they need. Amen. I'd like to, at this point, introduce our first speaker, James Jordan. He is the managing member of James Jordan CPA, and he's going to share with us his perspective from the finance side of COVID-19 response for administrators. James, if you'll take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I do have a presentation that I will share and talk from at the moment. And what we're going to talk about today is how to account for PPP. So a little bit about my firm. We're a national firm located in Atlanta and New York. We do audit, remote bookkeeping, consulting, and tax. Here's some contact information, how to reach me. And I've got to put a disclaimer in here as Todd will appreciate. Anything that I say or anybody else might say on this webinar is not to be taken as a means of avoiding taxes or penalties, etc. Your situation is different, and specific advice for your situation should be gained from your own professionals. All right, Paycheck Protection Program. First and foremost, it is a loan. It is not income. It is a loan. Funding is provided by the U.S. Treasury. You make your application through your own bank, and the bank will then prepare the loan package and send it on your behalf to the Small Business Administration. The SBA will approve or adjust the dollar amount and return that approval back to the bank with funding. You then sign the loan document certifying accuracy of the information that you provided in your loan application, and the bank will deposit the funds in your checking account. It's not a sure thing that the loan will be forgiven. Everybody says, gee, I can get this loan and it'll be forgiven. That is not a sure thing. You basically have 2 months to expend the funds for the purposes outlined in the Act and account for them with the Treasury Department within 6 months. IRS has been given oversight of the loans. We don't know what that means yet. All of this is still somewhat unfolding. So let's look at the receipt of funds. This is a loan. So what you're going to do is deposit the money in the bank, and you're going to create a loan payable. It is not income. Do not create an income account, because you owe this money back until you get the approval from the government that some portion or all of it has been forgiven. Now, so we don't lose it in the money that's in the system, I recommend that you create a designated funds account and you put this 10,000 over in designated. And we're going to take it out of unrestricted. Notice that these are two transactions. The first is naturally occurring as a part of a deposit. The second is going to require a journal entry. Now, how do we disperse the funds? We're going to disperse the funds coming out of cash where the loan was deposited, and we're going to debit or reduce the designated funds. But it is absolutely critical and key at this point. In your memo line, put in there what those funds were for. And preferably go ahead and put the actual account code that you would have normally charged in order to write that check. You're going to need this later on when we determine where the funds were spent, and did we in fact spend them according to the guidelines and the regulations of the loan. And then third, how do we close the loan? Well, there are multiple transactions, and this is where it can get a little interesting. First thing we want to do, assuming that the loan was forgiven. You don't do this until the loan is forgiven, or some portion thereof. But the first thing you do is you take the loan off the books, and you only take the amount of loan off the books that was forgiven. So if all of it was forgiven, you see the $10,000 coming off. However, if the SBA and the Treasury Department come back and say, no, you actually paid the mortgage principal with this, not just the interest. You cannot be forgiven for the mortgage principal, only the interest amount. Then you may still actually owe some of the funds back. It's very critical that you pay attention to what can and cannot these funds be used for. So once that occurs, second transaction, now you're going to know why we needed to record these in the memo, because you're going to go in and find those transactions and now put them in their proper place, reducing the designated funds. So now we've taken everything off the balance sheet or the statement of financial position and expensed it like we normally would have. Okay? When you do that, your balance of your designated funds is going to go back up to $10,000 in this case. That's okay. We're going to need a third entry that will remove those designated funds and put them back into unrestricted. What this will do will give you the right expense reporting and at the same time account properly for the loan. Because had you only stopped with just this first transaction at the receipt of funds, you would basically end up back in this position. Okay? What happens if you don't receive the funds and you don't expend them and they don't require you to account for them, etc., by the end of the year? Then in order to get your year end to look correctly, you will only do C2. And at the point that you close the books for year end in 2020, on January 1 of 2021, you want to reverse this so that we get our designated funds back in place. So here's what the whole thing looks like. And I'm going to make these slides available to be distributed so that you can have a look at them. There are going to be questions, there are going to be what ifs, or here's how we do it, or how do we do that. I've used a numbering nomenclature very similar to what ACS uses. I assume most of you use ACS, so this might be familiar with most of you. But when you get the slide set, these are actually links that will take you to the Department of Treasury, to their tools area, and give you the overviews and then information for you as a borrower, how to make the application, how to calculate what you can get as a loan amount, and things like that. So in red, there's my email address, there's my office number, and since we're in the middle of this COVID-19, here's my cell phone number. So if you have a question, you're sitting in front of the system and you go, oh gosh, now what do I do? Give me a call. That's what I'm here for.
Well, thank you so much. The administrators on a call a couple weeks ago, James, actually asked that question specifically, and I know that that's going to be really important information for them to have as we process the PPP in our own churches and dioceses. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I should mention at this time that the slides that James mentioned in his presentation, as well as this webinar, are all recorded and available on the CEEP website. Our next presenter, it's my pleasure to introduce Wajida Small. She is HR Director at Trinity Church, and she's going to be sharing with us some things from the HR perspective.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm Wajida Small. I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer with Trinity Church Wall Street in New York. I've been with Trinity a little over 2.5 years now, going on my 3rd year. So I know there were some very specific questions around paid time off, especially with vacations being canceled during this time. So for us, well, the one thing that I think should be taken into consideration is how you manage your paid time off. Specifically for us, we use an accrual process, and staff have a certain number of days per year that they're allowed to use. But what we also have is we have an automatic rollover of 5 days. So one thing that we have been considering is whether or not we want to increase the number of rollover days, since folks won't be able to take vacation. The challenge that we are in is that historically, the majority of our staff take their vacation in the second half of the year. And with the expectation that we're going to be back the second half of the year, can we really afford for the majority of our staff to be out? While we have been really great working from home, so we don't have much, I would say that there's that much of a backlog of work where folks can't take vacation. We are still going to be rebuilding, working in a different way. So we have to consider how many people can go on vacation, if we can allow them to go on vacation. So there are several options. One thing that we are definitely encouraging people to do is take staycations if they can, to actually take some time off, get away from the computer, because the research has shown that when we blend work and home, we kind of don't know when to turn it on and turn it off, and people are getting burned out very easily, and we don't want that to happen. So we encourage people to take staycations, take a couple of days off here and there, and some have actually been doing that. So that kind of allows folks to use their vacation time. We're looking at it now from an organizational view, how many folks have taken vacation year to date already, looking at how much time is there so that we can determine the best approach as it relates to rolling over more than the 5 days, continuing to encourage folks to take vacation, depending on how many taken was actually, how much vacation was taken before we left. We may not get into the issue where there's so many people that can take vacation the second half of the year. The other thing that we're considering, at least from a New York perspective, is the possibility of this second wave in the fall, where we might have to revert back to this work from home scenario and how that's going to work. So I would encourage folks to really look at how you manage your vacation. That's the process that's working for us in terms of looking at it from an accrual and a rollover process. And again, if you can, encourage your staff to take some time completely away, not answering emails. I know folks can't really go places, but taking a break is very important. And we encourage our staff all the time to take the time that they need to just get away from their computer. The other question that came up was around bringing staff back. So we are actually in the process of undergoing several exercises to identify what that looks for us. And we are trying to follow, the guidelines. So in New York State, Governor Cuomo is implementing a phased approach. And for him, the first phase of, I'll just say, a soft opening for those that he would consider, I don't want to use the term essential, but roles that can allow for social distancing, low risk. He's looking at that first, and he's looking at that from an upstate perspective. Trinity is in the downstate, so we would be the second wave of the first phase, if you will. So internally, we're looking at it in terms of phases. We're looking at the staff that have to be in the physical space, whether it's in the church, whether it's in the office building, identifying again the low risk, how we can navigate folks being in an office in terms of the necessary people. We are looking at the space in and of itself to see if it's possible, can we, abide by social distancing in the space, again, both in the church and in the office space as well. And looking at that in terms of who needs to be in the office, how we can maximize remote work, and when we can go in. It's hard to pinpoint when we can actually go in because we're still in the, shelter in place under New York, but I would consider looking at it in a phased approach as well. What are the absolute, for lack of a better term, critical staff that need to be in a physical space in order for you to continue to work? From there, what are the roles that don't necessarily need to be there, but the presence would provide value to the work being done in the space? And then also, again, it all depends on the location that you're in and what the guidelines that are going to be in place. How can you maximize the remote work? Again, having been out for 7 weeks, for us, we've learned that we can do awesome things remotely, but we also have some programming. And when we're thinking about the church, that it would be great to be in the physical space. So there are some things that we need to be in the physical space in order for that to happen, in terms of some of the community programming, considering, and we have to take that into consideration as well. How can we continue to service the community in the way that we have, and if we can continue to serve them in the way that we have in the past, and how that's going to look as well in terms of the changes. So that phased approach has been working for us. We're undergoing several exercises, and we look at the various, I'll say, the different kind of facets. So we look at the church, we look at the building or the office space, we look at the cemetery because we have a cemetery, and then we also have an off-site location, which we have a retreat center, and all of those function very differently. So we have to look at how we're going to open those differently. However, again, for each of them, they are going to be done in a phased approach based on the guidelines that we received from our state and city government as it relates to whatever continuing restrictions are going to be in place for our community.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of great information about both considering how we deal with the present with regards to considering PTO and how it might roll over, or how people might be able to manage this sort of blended work schedule, and then how we're going to deal with the future. So I really appreciate, for the administrators that ask those questions, your answers, Wajida. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, Lori Kazalonis, is a Senior Vice President for Church Pension Group in New York. And she's going to share with us CPG's efforts and some considerations that we as administrators might have facing the tail end of these, in some of our cities, social distancing and continued response to COVID-19.
Thanks, Zach. Let's hope this is toward the end. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Thanks for having me again today. I also want to commend the wonderful work that the administrators all on the phone are doing. I think you're doing yeoman's work under really trying circumstances. And I also know that many of you have been on prior calls, so I'm going to go through the CPG's response pretty quickly, but also try to tell you what we're hearing for questions, because I suspect many of you may have those same questions. So as you know, CPG in late March sent an application to all bishops that there was the opportunity to apply for pension waivers for clergy. And I just want to tell you that our bishops have been very, very thoughtful. We are receiving applications. The applications are being processed. In essence, we are offering to pay 1 or 2 months of clergy assessments if the waivers are approved. And the clergy will receive credited service for those months. One of the questions that comes up a lot is this just pushing the receivable down the road, or is this really not needing to pay that. And special funds are being used from Church Pension Group to actually pay those assessment payments to free up some dollars in the parishes. So the clergy person will receive credited service. At this point, there's also no expiration date. So if you have other opportunities for funds and decide in July you need to apply for these funds, be in touch with your bishops. And also we will communicate broadly if at some point we decide that this program is going to end. So don't feel like you need to do something immediately. The next thing is the 90-day grace period. As you know, we've provided everyone with a 90-day additional grace period for all of their health benefit billing, their property coverage, and we committed that no cancellations would happen in April, May, and June. So we're getting the question, so what happens next? What happens at the end of June? We've had a number of administrators reach out and say, what do we do? So I will tell you, if you or you know of parishes that really look at the end of June and say, this is still going to be difficult for us, ask them to be in touch with us. We will work out some sort of a payment program. The funds will be due, but we will work with you to figure out how that happens over time, because we recognize that at the end of June isn't necessarily the magic date. Another thing that we put out pretty early was in our health plans, in the medical trust health plans. As you know, all the testing for COVID, copays, deductibles, coinsurances were all waived by the CARES Act. In addition, the medical trust waived copays, deductibles, and coinsurances for all treatment of COVID. We put out some information around telehealth and virtual health visits, and I will tell you that that's probably where the bulk of our confusion lies at this point. Telehealth were the programs that were in place through Anthem, Cigna, and Kaiser, where you could actually apply, you could go in the app and schedule a telehealth visit through a telehealth platform. For those visits, the copays are waived for the entire rest of the year. Additionally, we realize that many doctors are not wanting people to come into their office. So if you had a traditional doctor's appointment that can be done virtually, that is not telehealth. That is a virtual health benefit visit, and those claims will be paid just like you actually went into the doctor's office. So we've had a fair number of calls about the confusion around that. So hopefully this provides you a little bit more clarity about that. An interesting fact, in all of last year, there were 200-ish telehealth visits in all of our plans. And in the last month, there were 2,000 telehealth visits. So that's just an interesting piece of information. I know you all are busy applying for PPP loans. I know a lot of the church has received them. We can provide you with consolidated statements. We have provided almost 1,100 of them as of Friday. So I know it's a quick hurry to make sure you get to the money before it's spent out. But if you need a consolidated statement for us, we're turning them around in sometimes one day. So please reach out to client services and get a consolidated statement. Our education and wellness team is busy trying to get resources out there to help you all navigate this challenging time. In March, there was a managing anxiety in the coronavirus period, and we had almost 350 attendees at that webinar. There have been a couple of Fidelity webinars that we've done in partnership around market volatility. We've had 100 plus at each one of those. Just to let you know what's coming up, there's a psychological first aid webinar. There's two of them, one on May 20th and one on May 21st, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. These are going to be open to the entire church, including your vestries. So if you have vestries that this might be beneficial for, please, as you see these come out they'll be in our client information that we send out. Please do spread the word broadly on that. In June, we're going to do a fraud prevention during the pandemic. We have heard, unfortunately, that bad people are using this time to increase fraud. So there's going to be a fraud prevention. This has specifically impacted our retirees, which makes me very sad, but we're trying to educate them on what's going on out there. We're going to have a Caring for Caregivers in partnership with Cigna on June 18th with an introduction from Tracy Lind, who some of you may know as the former dean of the cathedral in Ohio. And then another one, Understanding EAP, at the end of June. So look for these, and please do join us if these can be helpful for you. I also want to remind you that our church insurance team stands ready to answer questions, to guide and help. There's a risk management tip sheet for coronavirus on our website. Church Publishing has expanded their free resources, and I just want to give you an easy way to get there, which is churchpublishing.org/free resources. That is the quickest way to get to this list of resources. And I want to share with you that there have been lots of free resources that have been downloaded. The Holy Week and Easter download was almost 7,000 downloads. Living Lent, 3,500 downloads. And the Candle Walk, which is a way to read a book for children, has had 10,000 reads. So we're thrilled to know that the church is taking us up on the opportunity to utilize these resources. And again, I thank you for what you do, and I thank you to CEEP for having me here. And if you need anything or have questions, feel free to reach out to me or our call center. Thanks, Zach. Back to you.
Thanks, Lori. I really appreciate you sharing both the unique questions that you have been fielding from churches and administrators, but also addressing some of the concerns related to assessments and waivers and those sorts of things. It's great to hear all of the resources and answers and help that CPG is bringing to the table. So thank you so much. I'm going to make a quick announcement before we move on to our final presenter, Todd Raylew, who is bringing us a legal perspective, just to recognize that there have been many people that have joined us while Lori was speaking. And I want to mention a couple of things that happened earlier on the call and where you might be able to access that important information. So our first speaker was James Jordan, who brought us the financial perspective. He's a CPA, and he shared with us how to account for PPP, which I know is on the minds of a lot of people right now. He actually had a presentation that's going to be available on the CEEPnetwork.org website. This has been recorded, so you'll be able to access both the recording of the sharing of that information, but also the presentation itself will be available there. Also, Wajida Small, HR Director at Trinity Wall Street, has also shared the HR perspective, which I know a lot of people were considering, related to how we account for PTO and considerations for people both as they're working now and considerations as they come back onto our campuses and work there. So I wanted to make sure to mention that those resources will be available on the CEEP Network website. And also, after Todd speaks, we will have a short Q&A. So please be posting your questions that you might have for our panelists in the webinar chat form, and I'll make sure that as many of those as we can get addressed here at the end of our call. Without further ado, I want to introduce Todd Raylew. He is a partner at Pluge, Shadley, Ratcher, and Braun in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he's going to share a legal perspective for us related to our administrative response to COVID-19. So with that, Todd, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I am also the Assistant Chancellor for the Episcopal Diocese of Indianapolis, so we're fielding a number of these issues that come up from the churches within our diocese as well. With regard to the Paycheck Protection Program, again, like Lori, I'm going to assume that you guys have an understanding of some of the basics of it, and I'll talk about some of the recent guidance that has come out. One of the major concerns that has come up is that there's been a lot of confusing messaging coming out of Washington relating to the PPP, and sort of open and veiled threats about increased scrutiny on people and organizations who took loans through the program. And churches concerned, am I in a position, because I have an endowment, do I need to return my loan? Do I need to withdraw my application? And the advice that we have been giving is no. That's not really what the requirement is. And what you're really seeing is sort of a response to political pressure that's out there about a loan program that was partially funded, where a number of the loans went to large public companies, and that has receiving some scrutiny. That doesn't mean that churches are necessarily going to get caught up in that same level of scrutiny. What the focus is from what has come out, and this all relates to a frequently asked question that the U.S. Department of Treasury answered. The focus is on large companies with adequate sources of liquidity, particularly public companies, and that the auditing that the Treasury Department has announced is for loans over $2 million. And so I'm not aware of any churches, at least within our diocese, that had loans even close to $2 million. So it's just not a major concern. And at the bottom line, the required certification that you would have made on your application or will make on your application if you've yet to apply is that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. So economic uncertainty is necessarily forward-looking in nature. You know, many of us, I mean, none of us can really accurately predict what's going to happen with donations to our churches in the future, what's going to happen with pledging. Are people going to honor their pledges, even if they have so far? Will they continue to do so as fallout from this continues to happen? So, you know, that from a legal perspective, it would be very hard to hold somebody liable or hold an organization liable for making a good faith representation that there was economic uncertainty. And the other part of the guidance I think is important to keep in mind, and I'll really emphasize the last words of this, but I'll give you the whole sentence just to lead up to it. Borrowers must make this certification in good faith, taking into account current business activity and their ability to access other sources of liquidity sufficient to support their ongoing operations in a manner that is not significantly detrimental to the business. And I would argue to you that if you are rating your endowment, you are creating significant detriment to your church, not just now, but for years to come, right? When we try to maintain reasonable spend rates on our endowments going forward, if you've had to take hundreds of thousands of dollars out of that, that you wouldn't have otherwise had to take out because of the PPP loan, I think that you are creating a significant detriment for your business going forward. Other things that have been answered, one of the questions that was a big question on one of the last panels that we were on for CEEP was what happens with clergy housing allowance? Is that payroll? Is that not payroll? So Treasury has answered that. That is properly included in payroll. It is, of course, subject to the $100,000 limit, just like any other compensation for individuals. And the other thing that's been answered that maybe if you have a PPP loan and you are trying to maximize your forgiveness, what if you've laid off, furloughed, fired employees before now? The idea is that you would want to rehire them before June 30th. The question appropriately has risen that, what happens if you attempt to rehire somebody and they decline? They've already gone out, got another job, they don't come back. What happens with that? There's not guidance out yet, but Treasury has indicated it's going to release guidance that says that if you made a good faith written offer to rehire somebody at their same compensation level and they decline, that will not reduce your PPP loan forgiveness. So those are some new developments since the last time we talked that I think may be relevant to churches. So if you have yet to apply, maybe you're one of the churches that has yet to apply. We all know that there was an agreement reached that there's $310 billion more. As of yesterday, the administration released a report saying that from this new tranche of money, this $310 billion, 2.2 million loans have been awarded for a total of $175 billion. So that's an average loan of about $79,000. They're also, the SBA and Treasury are trying to address concerns that arose during the sort of awarding of loans under the first set of money, that it favored larger lenders, larger businesses. They're reserving more time and earmarking more funds for smaller lenders. So they're reserving more time for them to submit their applications. Banking associations have suggested, I don't know if this is true, that most of the $310 billion is already accounted for in the backlog of applications that have already been submitted. So if you have not submitted an application yet, it's unclear whether or not there will be money left, but I would suggest that you would still submit an application because lawmakers have not ruled out possibly, putting more money into the program in the future. And one of the factors they'll certainly look at is the number of unfilled applications that are out there. I'll spend a few minutes on just contracts and copyright information. With regards to contracts and services, during COVID-19, some people are having trouble fulfilling contracts the church might be in, people might be having trouble fulfilling them. You've got to review the contract language carefully. The main provision, the provision you've heard about over and over again, is going to be the force majeure provision. There is not one set of language that appears in a force majeure provision. So you really need to look at your language, consult an attorney to determine what your rights are. Typically within these, though, there are references to natural disasters, war, acts of terrorism, other acts of God. Acts of God is one that's not defined typically. So, I mean, where does a pandemic fit in there? A lot of these do not explicitly address disease, epidemics, pandemics. So you really need to make a determination of how does this fit into the language in your contract. And parties seeking to excuse the performance does bear the burden of showing that they fit within the force majeure provision. Very briefly, beyond that, so you don't have a force majeure provision in the contract that you're thinking about. You need to focus on what your state law options would be. A couple of ideas. There's a doctrine of impossibility that typically exists. So if your performance is rendered impossible or effectively impracticable because of the disease, then, or a law that results from the disease, you may, under state law, have an ability to avoid contract performance on that basis. Frustration of purpose is also another option that's available in some states, where performance remains possible, but everybody knew going into the contract that there's a particular purpose that one party had, and that purpose has been entirely frustrated by this intervening event. That may also be available for you. In new contracts you're entering, we have a lot of uncertainty about the coronavirus. As referenced earlier, that we may have a resurgence in the fall. New contracts that you're entering, I would encourage you all to squarely address issues related to the outbreaks of illness or disease, epidemics, pandemics, declarations of emergency regarding the same from a health organization or government. I would encourage you in your force majeure provisions to address those things explicitly rather than having to argue that they fit into some larger category for new contracts going forward. On the copyright issue, very briefly, I think many of you are probably aware, if not, there is guidance out there from the Episcopal Church itself on this. The religious services exemption that we typically rely on under U.S. copyright law for what we show and what music we sing and produce in our on-site services, that fits under the religious services exemption of U.S. copyright law. Broadcasting of that stuff over the internet does not. It's considered a broadcast performance. So you may need to license certain of the music that you're using, things like that. Sermons, if they're given by clergy that are retained in your churches, typically the contracts with those and the way that those folks are called to service, typically those sermons are the property of the church itself. So that doesn't typically create an ongoing concern, even if you might have that sermon on your website for many years to come after that clergy person may leave. Again, look at your contract language, but that's typically what you're going to run into. But with music, for example, if you've got music that was created before 1922, typically that's outside of U.S. copyright law. But if there's a new arrangement that you're relying on, and maybe that may be subject to copyright law, many hymnals in the Hymnal 82, you can get licenses for them from a group called One License. I've not explored that thoroughly, so I don't know what the costs are associated with that. But my understanding is that a podcast/streaming license should be sufficient to cover your needs. Again, I don't know what the costs are on that, but that's something to keep in mind as many of us have switched to sort of online broadcasting of our services.
Thank you so much, Todd, for addressing both, or I guess, the PPP as well as considerations for contracts, renegotiating, and the force majeure clause, and then finally addressing the streaming, which so many of us are now in the business of doing. We did have a question in the chat. I'm going to encourage anyone that's on the webinar to put questions for our Q&A, which is coming up here shortly. And I'm hoping, Todd, that you can address this sort of at the tail end here. We have Joe Michael wondering if someone could explain church employees not being eligible for unemployment. That's Joe Michael from Trinity Cathedral in Sacramento.
Yeah, so I mean, I can address this briefly, and anybody else who has thoughts can chime in. So typically, unemployment is not available for churches, other religious organizations. Now, unemployment benefits that were provided under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act, I believe, are available to church employees. So there were expanded unemployment benefits made available under the CARES Act, and there was not an exclusion of church employees for those expanded benefits. I don't know if that answers the question. I hope so.
Thank you. So at this time, I'm going to go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I just add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I noticed that the person is in California. As I understand it, in California, you are allowed to waive unemployment. And in general, just from a given New York perspective, you can either pay unemployment insurance or you can pay, dollar for dollar in terms of you pay for the direct cost of the claim if one of your employees apply for uninsurance. So general rule of thumb, if you're not paying, if you've waived it, that means you're not paying into unemployment insurance and you're not paying dollar for dollar, which means there would not be any money, if you will, for any of your employees to get uninsurance if you've waived that. To Todd's point, there are different provisions now under coronavirus, so they might want to check into that. But in general, that's how it is in California. They're allowed to waive unemployment, where in New York, that's not necessarily the case. You have to either pay unemployment part into unemployment insurance or pay direct dollar for dollar for whatever claim comes from your employee.
Thank you. So at this time, I'm going to open up the discussion to our panelists while we're waiting for more questions to come in. Has anything that has been said on the webinar so far sparked anything for any of you? Do you all have anything to add? And I'll just leave it open. Well, thank you so much to each of our panelists. Just to give a little bit of background for this webinar, CEEP administrators have a conference call that was taking place before the COVID-19 period, and we've picked up the frequency of those calls, and all of the questions that have been addressed have come in this webinar from those calls. We'll be having another one of those calls on the 18th, and if you're interested in being added to the list of people that receive an invitation to that call, please reach out to the CEEP network and we can have you added to that list. We will be having future calls likely related to COVID-19 and particularly how we get back into our churches and navigate this process. I know there are a tremendous amount of questions and uncertainty related to that, so I want to recognize that we will likely reach out to many of the panelists who have talked on both this call and calls previous to this one. And as always, you can access all of the information that we've discussed today and on the other webinars on the CEEP network website. That's ceepnetwork.org. And there are a wide variety of webinars that CEEP has hosted to help churches and church administrators, particularly to navigate COVID-19 response. With that, I want to thank all of our panelists and Joe Schwimmer for helping to coordinate this. And if you will, please join me for a short prayer. Almighty God, by your grace alone, we are accepted and called to your service. Strengthen us by your Holy Spirit and make us worthy of our calling. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to everyone who joined us on this webinar. You can access this webinar on the CEEP Network website. And we look forward to speaking with you all again soon on a future webinar and on our conference calls with administrators. Thank you so much.